It's amazing when you think about how some minds really start out like on their quest to understand the world, you know? Like
Hmm.
Richard Feynman, even as a kid, before the whole physicist thing, he's already like doing experiments. You've got the magazine fire incident, the homemade photocell bell. He even makes like a basic telephone.
Right?
Like it's not just watching the world, it's about like poking it and seeing what happens.
Absolutely. And that urge to experiment, to build things and take them apart, it really tells you something.
Yeah.
And for someone who would later on tackle things like quantum electrodynamics, that early hands-on stuff probably gave him a feel for physics that goes way beyond just theory.
I see what you mean.
It's about getting a real gut feeling for cause and effect.
Which leads us to something kind of cool for today's deep dive.
Uh-huh.
We always hear about explaining things like, I'm five, right?
Yeah.
But what if we flip that around?
Okay.
What if we go into all this, like we're explaining it to a real genius?
Ah,
What new stuff might we find when we assume they already get a lot and we can focus on the tiny details and the weird connections?
that's a very interesting idea. Assuming our listeners super smart means we have to be really careful with what we say and consider things that most people might miss.
Exactly.
And it also helps us see the beauty in simple things.
And the genius we're going to use for this thought experiment is Richard Feynman himself,
Makes sense.
Nobel Prize winner, known for changing physics, like with those path integrals and quantum mechanics,
Oh, yeah.
but also for explaining really tough stuff in a way that anyone can understand.
He was great at that.
So we're looking at stories from when he was young, but through this special lens,
You okay?
finding the surprising bits that would even make a genius think.
I like it.
Like, we're searching for aha moments that get even clearer when you're super smart.
Yeah, we're not dumbing it down. We're making it super sharp for an audience that can handle it.
All right, let's start with some of Feynman's early stories. Even as a little kid, he was always building things like electric motors and amplifier.
Oh.
Now, thinking about explaining this to a genius, what does this early hands-on stuff tell us about learning and being creative?
For a mind that can think abstractly at such a high level, I think this early tinkering probably showed him how important it is to connect abstract theory with the real world.
Hmm.
A genius understands that real innovation often comes from really knowing the physical world by messing with it and experimenting.
Yeah.
It suggests that even the biggest leaps forward in thinking often come from a practical grasp of how things actually work.
That makes sense. And then there's this story about him inventing right triangle problems where he'd give you the difference between the sides instead of their lengths.
Okay.
It's a small change,
Uh-huh.
but it changes the whole problem.
Yeah.
What does this tell us about how he solved problems, especially from the point of view of a genius who loves elegant solutions?
A genius would immediately see this as an early sign of Feynman's ability to look at problems from unusual angles.
Interesting.
By changing what information you start with, he wasn't just looking for one answer, he was exploring the math in a deeper way.
I see.
It forced you to understand the concepts, not just use formulas.
So he was going beyond the original problem.
Exactly. He was making a harder, more interesting puzzle for himself.
Now let's look at the story of him fixing hotel radio. This hotel run by his aunt calls a young boy to fix their broken radio.
Really?
What parts of this would really intrigue a genius listener?
Well, a really smart person might notice how efficient that is.
How so?
The fact they called a kid means the usual experts couldn't do it.
Oh, that's true.
Or maybe they knew Feynman was good at this stuff even though he was young.
Yeah.
And him being willing to try to fix it with his big tools and youthful confidence shows he wasn't afraid to try things.
Yeah.
And not being afraid to try new things is something you see in a lot of groundbreaking thinkers.
Let's move on to communication. There's the Uncle Don broadcast he made for his sister, complete with his own sound effects like music, but he called it mouth music.
That's cute.
What's the big takeaway here, especially when we think about how literally his sister took it?
A genius would get right away that even in a simple situation, what the sender means and what the receiver hears can be different. Feynman was trying to recreate what a radio show sounded like, but his sister focused on how he was making the sounds with his mouth.
Yeah.
It shows how we all see things differently and how even clear intentions can get mixed up.
So even if you try to be clear, communication can still be tricky.
Exactly. It highlights the challenge of getting your message across perfectly.
What about the changes he made to the hotel switchboard?
Oh, yeah.
He wanted to make it better, but his aunt wasn't happy. Has there, like, general lessons about new ideas and how people react to them? Could a genius learn from this?
A really smart person would see that just because something is technically better doesn't mean people will like it.
True.
His aunt's resistance, even though it probably was an improvement, likely came from not knowing how it worked, not liking the change in routine, and maybe not understanding the tech behind it.
Yeah.
This shows that innovation isn't just about a great idea. It's also about explaining it well, making it easy to use, and understanding how things already work.
So even a logical improvement can fail if you don't consider the human factor.
Exactly.
Let's talk about the fraternity door incident. The group remembers no one admitting to taking the door. But Feynman was trying to explain he took a different one.
I remember that one.
What does this show us about group memory and how hard it is to change a story everyone believes?
A genius would probably see this as a real-life example of how our brains can trick us, especially with confirmation bias and how groups remember things.
Yeah.
The idea that no one took the door, even if it wasn't true, probably became a shared belief, making it hard for Feynman's different story to fit in. It highlights how social dynamics affect how we remember things, both individually and as a group, and how we resist information that goes against what we already believe.
Let's move on to his time at MIT. His choices for humanities courses were astronomy and philosophy. Why would a bright young mind be drawn to those? And what is his unique take on the English theme about liberty? Tell us about his independent thinking.
A genius often looks for the basic principles that connect different fields.
Okay.
Astronomy, with its study of the universe and its laws, probably appealed to his natural curiosity about the world on a grand scale.
Makes sense.
And philosophy, with its focus on big questions like existence, knowledge, and ethics, gave him a different way to use logic and reasoning.
And his take on liberty.
Right. His idea that social rules are a game of faking shows a mind that's not afraid to apply abstract ideas in new and maybe controversial ways.
Yeah.
It shows he valued independent thought over just accepting the usual interpretations.
What about his experience in the philosophy class with the mumbling professor?
Oh, yeah.
How could a genius make the most of a situation where the information wasn't easy to get?
A really smart person is usually good at learning on their own and finding ways to stay intellectually stimulated even when things aren't ideal. Feynman's reaction, focusing on something else while the professor mumbled, suggests he was resourceful in keeping his mind active even when the material wasn't great.
So he had an inner drive to learn.
Yes, a drive that didn't depend only on what was being presented to him.
Then there are his early observations about dreams.
Okay.
How does him trying to understand this personal experience through experiments and coming up with a little theory fit with the way a genius mind develops?
A genius often applies a scientific way of thinking, even to things that seem hard to measure.
I see.
Feynman trying to connect his dreams to things like his body or what was happening around him and then creating a simple explanation shows a natural tendency to look for patterns, come up with ideas, and build understanding through watching and logic, even without fancy scientific tools.
Moving on to learning from failure, there's the story about the pen company and their fake research.
Right.
What big difference between real science and just pretending to do science would a genius see here?
A genius understands that you have to know exactly what the problem is before you try to solve it. Yeah.
The pen company spending money on elaborate research that was pointless because they didn't understand the real issue is the opposite of how Feynman focused on basic principles and direct observation.
That's a good point.
It shows how you can be busy doing things without actually making progress, and the importance of being honest and focused on the real problem.
And the funny story about him being mistaken for a chief research chemist with just a bottle washer as his staff.
Oh yeah, that one.
What subtle commentary on how people see scientists and the reality of groundbreaking work could a genius pick up from this?
A really intelligent person would probably find the irony in that situation. You know how people exaggerate the importance of titles and resources in science? The contrast between the fancy title and him working alone emphasizes that big breakthroughs can often come from one person's dedication and passion, not a big team or fancy equipment. Let's look at Professor Slater's advice to Feynman about grad school. He told him to go to Princeton instead of staying at MIT.
Interesting choice.
What crucial insight about intellectual growth could a genius grasp from this advice?
A genius knows that being exposed to different ideas and ways of thinking is important and that staying in one place can limit you.
Yeah.
Slater probably understood that experiencing different perspectives, teaching styles, and research areas would make Feynman a better thinker and problem solver.
Makes sense.
Even the brightest minds benefit from new ideas and approaches.
And his early, awkward attempts to be nice at Princeton and his first experience at the dean's tea with the mysterious
How about that?
How fast did he figure out what those social cues meant?
A genius is good at observing and understanding complex systems, and that includes social situations.
Hmm,
The fact that Feynman first got the dean's laughter wrong, but then quickly learned what it meant, shows he could adapt to a new social environment.
right.
He used his sharp observation skills to figure out social signals,
Yeah.
just like he would approach a scientific problem.
Then there's his short but important time studying biology.
A little detour.
What might have made such a promising physicist switch gears? And what transferable skills could a genius see him gaining from this?
Well, a genius is often curious about everything and wants to learn the basic principles of different areas of science.
True.
Feynman's move to biology was probably driven by that same desire to understand how living things work.
Yeah.
Even though he went back to physics, the things he learned, like careful lab techniques, using precise scientific language, and knowing the potential problems in biological research, definitely improved his overall scientific abilities and gave him a new perspective.
Let's dive into his seminar experiences at Princeton. There's the anticipation, the nerves, and then the intellectual debate itself.
Sounds intense.
How might a genius handle the anxiety of presenting new ideas to their peers?
A genius often finds that getting completely absorbed in their work helps them forget about being nervous.
Really?
Feynman's experience suggests that once he started explaining his ideas and getting into the intellectual challenge, he wasn't anxious anymore. This highlights the power of being really motivated by what you're doing and focusing on the intellectual pursuit to overcome personal worries.
And the reactions to his seminar, Pauli's famous dismissive comment, and Einstein's quiet presence.
It's a tough crowd.
What does this setting and those reactions tell us about the world of high-level intellectual discussion?
A genius works in a world where their ideas are constantly being scrutinized.
Yeah.
Having giants like Pauli and Einstein there shows how high the stakes are when you're presenting new ideas in cutting-edge science.
Exactly.
Pauli's quick and critical response, even though it was blunt, shows how tough the standards are and how new ideas are rigorously examined.
Right.
It emphasizes the need to be able to defend your ideas and handle criticism.
He also tells some great stories about encountering topology theorems.
Okay.
How did he, as a physicist, approach these complicated math concepts without having formal training in math?
A genius is often able to understand things intuitively and see patterns, which allows them to grasp difficult concepts in unusual ways. Feynman's approach to topology, using his observations about funny properties instead of formal proofs, shows how he could understand things through analogy and a sense of the underlying structure.
So he found a way to understand it even without the formal math.
Exactly. It highlights that deep insight can sometimes come before rigorous mathematical proof.
Let's think about the simple but revealing jiggling hand experiment.
Right.
What could a genius appreciate about the subtle interplay of conscious and unconscious communication shown here?
A very intelligent person is often aware of the subtle ways people communicate and how words aren't always enough.
I see.
The jiggling hand experiment suggests that there are subtle, maybe subconscious cues that can transmit information in ways we don't fully understand.
That's fascinating.
A genius might be especially interested in how nonverbal communication can reveal things, even when we're not consciously aware of it.
And the story about the darning needle and the claim that it doesn't sting.
Oh, right.
What fundamental principle about learning does Feynman's insistence on testing this show for a mind that values real evidence?
A genius has a deep respect for actually testing things out as the best way to find out what's true.
Yeah.
Feynman being willing to test a seemingly obvious statement through direct experience shows how committed he was to basing knowledge on reality.
Makes sense.
Even when something seems self-evident, a genius understands that testing it is important because you might be surprised by what you find.
Now, during his time at Los Alamos, there's this story about the lieutenant and the cam design.
Oh, yes.
How did Feynman use a little bit of cleverness to keep his work from being messed with?
A genius can also be practical and knows how to work within systems to protect their work.
That's true.
Feynman, pretending he didn't know things, allowed him to avoid unnecessary oversight from someone who didn't understand the technical details.
Yeah.
It shows he was aware of how organizations work and the importance of keeping intellectual work safe from people who might mean well but end up causing problems.
And his clever letter to the censor about Arabic numerals.
A classic.
How did he use logic and wit to challenge a rule that didn't make sense?
A genius often has a sharp mind and can clearly explain why things are illogical.
Right.
Feynman's letter brilliantly showed how absurd the censorship rule was when applied to math, using clear reasoning and a little sarcasm.
I like it.
It shows his ability to think critically, find flaws in systems, and use language to persuade and solve problems even outside of science.
He also noticed several security problems at Los Alamos, like the easy-to-bypass padlocks and filing cabinets.
Interesting.
What could a genius observe about the often surprising disconnect between high-level intellectual work and simple practical security?
A smart and observant person often spots weaknesses in systems, even in areas outside their expertise.
I see.
Feynman's observations show a common thing happening. Focusing on complex intellectual challenges can make people forget about simple but important things like basic security. It shows the importance of thinking about problems in a complete way, considering both the theoretical and the practical.
Then there's his experience explaining neutrons to the plant engineers.
Okay.
Why was this seemingly basic scientific knowledge so important for people working on such a complex project?
A genius understands that core concepts are the foundation for everything else, and that they're important for people at all levels of expertise.
Right.
While the scientists at Los Alamos might have thought neutrons were basic stuff for the engineers, it gave them a crucial understanding of the processes they were working with. This shows how important it is to explain basic principles clearly so that everyone involved in a complex project is on the same page.
And the story about the complicated blueprints and his seemingly simple yet crucial question about the window symbol.
Oh, right. Mr. Zumwalt's reaction is key there, too.
Yeah.
A genius isn't afraid to ask what might seem like a dumb question, even when dealing with something really complex. Feynman's direct question cut through all the complicated details and found a basic ambiguity in the blueprint, a misunderstanding that could have caused big problems.
Wow.
Mr. Zumwalt saying, "You're a genius," shows how powerful it is to think clearly and find critical flaws that others might miss because they're overwhelmed by the details.
So sometimes asking a simple question can reveal a big problem.
Exactly. It highlights the value of focusing on the fundamentals.
Let's talk a bit about his experiences with loss. There's the anecdote about his grandmother's phone call and his thoughts on the difference between coincidence and supernatural explanations.
Okay.
A genius often approaches even emotionally charged events with a rational and analytical perspective.
That's interesting.
Feynman's thinking about the odds of the coincidental phone call shows his commitment to thinking about things in terms of probability and his skepticism towards explanations that aren't based on evidence. Makes sense.
It highlights a mind that looks for logical explanations, even for things that seem unlikely.
And his delayed emotional response to Arlene's death.
That's a tough one.
A genius, while capable of deep emotion, might process grief in ways that reflect their intellectual way of thinking.
Yeah.
Feynman, focusing first on the biological reality of Arlene's passing and then having an emotional reaction later triggered by a specific memory, suggests that even profound emotional experiences can be processed through a lens of logic and analysis.
It's like his brain was trying to understand it first.
It shows the complex nature of grief and how people experience it differently.
The Mossler lock at Los Alamos clearly gave him some intellectual entertainment.
It seems like he found amusement in unusual things.
What does his close observation of the bolt reveal about his natural curiosity and enjoyment of figuring out how things work?
A genius is often fascinated by how things work, even everyday objects. Feynman's attention to the details of the lock mechanism shows a deep curiosity about how things function and a real pleasure in understanding their inner workings.
I see that.
This kind of attention to detail is often a sign of a mind that wants to understand everything about the universe. And his lucky discovery at Oak Ridge, that many filing cabinets could be opened with the same combination, the first few digits of ESMIC.
Oh, yeah, that's a funny one.
A genius can sometimes find big flaws by being observant and a bit playful.
Yeah.
Feynman's discovery showed a basic security lapse, probably because people weren't thinking creatively enough.
True.
The fact that many important cabinets had the same predictable combination shows how important it is to think about even obvious vulnerabilities in any system.
His experience with the psychological evaluations is also interesting.
What do you think a genius might observe about these evaluations and how people approach them?
Well, a genius often looks at formal assessments, critically analyzing not just the content, but also the methods and how others behave.
Right.
Feynman's thoughts on the psychiatrist's questions and his amusement at the other interviewees' strategy show that he understood the subjective nature of these evaluations and the different ways people try to handle them. The electric company prank and his parents' different reactions give us a peek into his personality.
What could a genius appreciate about his sense of humor and the varied responses to unconventional behavior?
A genius often has a playful mind and is willing to push boundaries.
Yeah.
Feynman's prank, even though it was mischievous, shows a creative side and a willingness to test limits.
And his parents' reactions.
Right, his parents' different reactions highlight how people respond differently to unusual behavior, even within a family.
True.
It shows that what's considered normal or acceptable varies from person to person.
Let's think about his insights into teaching and learning. His dissatisfaction with the physics colloquium because it lacked real intellectual engagement is telling.
It is.
What does this say about the best environment for sharp thinking, even among experts?
A genius needs to be actively involved and challenged intellectually.
Hmm.
Feynman's disappointment with the passive nature of the colloquium shows that active participation, asking tough questions, and really exchanging ideas are crucial for staying sharp intellectually.
So just listening isn't enough.
Exactly. Just passively receiving information without the chance to question it and explore it further can lead to intellectual stagnation, no matter how smart you are.
And his Thoop failure during his first teaching attempt and the important lesson he learned about asking direct questions.
It's a classic teaching story.
A genius understands that to communicate and teach effectively, you need to interact with your audience.
Absolutely.
Feynman's mistake was assuming his students understood because they were quiet.
Yeah. He learned that asking direct questions is essential to gauge real comprehension and find out where people are confused.
And his later attempts to avoid questions.
Right. That highlights the challenge of being a good teacher, encouraging participation but not shutting down questions.
His regular visits to the alibi room and the bartender already knowing his order offer a small but maybe revealing detail about his routine.
Interesting.
What could a genius see in these patterns of behavior?
Well, like everyone else, a genius can find comfort and a needed break in routine. Feynman going to the alibi room regularly suggests he needed a familiar environment away from the demands of his intellectual life.
It was his place to relax.
And the bartender, knowing his order, indicates an established pattern, maybe offering a sense of normalcy in a life that was often unpredictable.
His view on patents, wanting only a symbolic $1 for his inventions, is very telling.
It is.
What does this show us about his main motivations as a scientist and innovator?
A genius is often driven by the joy of discovery and the pursuit of knowledge, not fame or money.
Right.
Feynman wanting only a token payment for his inventions shows what really motivated him: the thrill of creating something new and advancing knowledge, not getting rich.
Stepping into the world of dating and social dynamics, there's the predictable tomorrow night line from the Showgirls.
Ah, the classic line.
What might a genius observer notice about these repeated social scripts?
A genius often picks up on social patterns and how predictable human interactions can be. Feynman recognizing the Showgirls line suggests he understood these common social rituals and maybe even had a detached, almost analytical view of them.
And the master's questionable lessons in social dynamics and Feynman's often funny attempts to follow them, including the too many sandwiches realization and his dramatic outburst.
Those are some great stories.
What does this show us about the complexity of human behavior and the limits of using simple rules to understand it?
A genius recognizes that people are complex and unpredictable.
Absolutely.
Feynman's often comical failures trying to use the master's simple rules highlight how nuanced and context-dependent social interactions are.
So there's no easy formula for social success.
Exactly. It shows that trying to reduce human behavior to a set of rules just doesn't work.
Let's talk about his amazing mental calculation skills, like figuring out E to a high power, and his performance in the abacus competition.
He was incredible with numbers.
What was the secret to his speed and accuracy in the E calculation?
A genius often develops strategies that use deep understanding and efficient mental models. In the case of E, Feynman probably used his knowledge of important mathematical constants and logarithmic relationships to quickly estimate and approximate instead of memorizing tons of digits.
So he applied his knowledge in a clever way.
Yes, it was an application of his fundamental math knowledge to do something that seemed impossible.
And how did he win the abacus competition?
A genius often focuses on understanding the concept instead of just mechanically doing things.
I see.
Feynman's win wasn't because he moved the beads faster, but because he understood numbers and calculations on a deeper level. He used approximations and real-world conversions like between cubic feet and cubic inches to get answers faster than someone just focusing on the abacus itself.
So it was about understanding not just mechanics.
Exactly. It shows that understanding the principles is more powerful than just knowing the procedure.
His attempts to learn Portuguese are full of funny stories.
They are.
What does the Consequentemente story show about his unusual way of learning languages?
Well, a genius can sometimes have a practical and maybe unconventional approach to learning new skills.
Okay.
Feynman's funny attempt to combine his Spanish with Portuguese, leading to the grand but slightly off consequentemente, shows he was willing to communicate and focus on getting the general meaning across.
He wasn't afraid to make mistakes.
Exactly. It reflects a confidence in his ability to be understood, even if his language skills weren't perfect.
His observations about Brazilian culture, like the open hole in the road, offer a stark contrast to U.S. practices.
It's interesting how those small differences can be revealing.
What could a genius infer from these details about different cultural priorities?
A genius is often good at noticing cultural nuances and the values they reflect.
Right.
Feynman's observation about the whole shows a potential difference in how Brazil and the U.S. approach safety rules and public works.
So little things can tell us a lot about a society.
Exactly. These seemingly minor details can give us valuable insights into broader social norms and values.
And his choice to give his physics lectures in Portuguese despite not being fluent.
That's dedication.
What could a genius recognize as the reason behind this choice?
A genius often prioritizes clear communication and connecting with their audience.
Yeah.
Feynman's decision to lecture in Portuguese, even though he wasn't perfect at it, probably came from realizing that it would help his Brazilian students understand better than if he spoke English.
It shows he cared about his students' learning.
Yes, it demonstrates a focus on the learner's experience and a willingness to adapt his communication style for their benefit.
His thoughts on his physics work in Brazil, including his doubts about his nuclear theory, and his strong criticisms of the electricity and magnetism textbook, are insightful.
They are.
What big concern about science education could a genius identify from these experiences?
A genius is deeply concerned about the accuracy and effectiveness of how knowledge is passed on. Feynman's worries about his nuclear theory work came from it not being able to make accurate predictions because it had too many adjustable parameters.
Right.
This highlights a key aspect of good scientific modeling.
And a text.
His harsh criticism of the physics textbook using the Emperor of China's nose analogy shows how worried he was about people being taught wrong or superficial information, which leads to a weak understanding of scientific principles.
Yeah.
He believed that having accurate basic knowledge and being able to think critically were essential for science education.
Finally, the outline mentions his experience giving the messenger lectures at Cornell.
Oh, yes.
What could a genius see is the significance of this event in his career and aspirations?
A genius often has long-term goals and ambitions.
True.
Feynman giving the messenger lectures at Cornell was him achieving a long-held dream, showing that his contributions to physics were recognized and that he could explain complex ideas to a wider audience.
An important moment in his career.
It's a major milestone in a career dedicated to both advancing knowledge and sharing it with others.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Richard Feynman's early experiences, looking at it through the lens of explaining it to a genius, several key themes stand out. We see the huge impact of natural curiosity and how important hands-on exploration is.
Right.
His way of solving problems was always insightful and unconventional.
And his ability to communicate and the potential for misunderstanding.
Yes, and we explored his intellectual independence and his commitment to basic principles.
And we saw how he learned and adapted from both his successes and failures.
What becomes clear when we analyze these stories, as if we're talking to someone incredibly intelligent, is the elegance and connections between seemingly unrelated events.
I agree.
Each story, when looked at closely, gives us deeper insights into how a remarkable mind develops and highlights fundamental principles of learning, innovation, and human interaction that go beyond just Feynman's early life.
Right.
And that brings us to a final thought-provoking question for you, our listener.
Right.
Thinking about Feynman's journey through this, explain to a genius perspective what parts of his approach, like his constant questioning, his willingness to challenge norms, or his dedication to understanding the fundamentals, could you apply to your own intellectual pursuits or your quest to understand the world?
It's a question worth pondering.
And to push it even further, what seemingly basic questions in your field, if explored with real intellectual rigor, could lead to profound and unexpected discoveries?
That's a great question.
By embracing Feynman's blend of curiosity and rigorous thinking, even about simple things, you might find yourself on a path to groundbreaking understanding. We encourage you to learn more about the extraordinary life and work of Richard Feynman, and maybe try this explain to a genius approach when exploring other areas of knowledge that interest you.
You might be surprised by what you find.
You might be surprised by how much you discover.